Hi, this is Rick Garcia. Today we're going to be going over the as-is contract. Our goal today is for you to get a complete understanding of what this contract is all about and the intricacies of it. Hopefully by the end of the class you guys will have a complete understanding on how to fill it out. All right, everyone, so pay close attention. So you can see it says as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. Before we start on line number one, if you guys, when you print these contracts up from Form Simplicity, they're all going to come with a unique serial number for each contract to identify the contract that can be traced back to your software. So just understand that any contracts that go out from your Form Simplicity can be traced back to you. All right, so on line number one, it's going to be line number 1 and 2 is going to be your parties. If you're representing the seller, I would always recommend that you request a copy of their driver's license so as not to make a mistake when you put the seller's name on there. The spelling is very important, so you want to make sure that you spell the names correctly, so thereby eliminating you having to do an addendum later on for a name correction. So if you're representing the seller, and you receive the contract from the buyer, obviously they should have put the buyer's name in there. In the event that you're representing the buyer, you're going to also ask them for ID as well, so that way you have all the information correctly. Now, a lot of times when you're representing the buyer, you don't know the seller's name. You're just looking on MLS and the seller's name is not there, so I go to public record. For example, with Dade County, I'll go to miamidade.gov and pull up the property information and get the seller's name and fill the information in from there. Next, we go to line number 6, which is the little numbers on the left here. Those are the numbers that when I revert to. So it's 6, and on the contract, it's number 1. Property address. You want to make sure that you put the correct property address in there. And then on B, the county that it's located in. If it's Miami-Dade County, you need to write Miami-Dade. Don't just write Dade County, because we are Miami-Dade. There is a Dade elsewhere, so you want to make sure that you put Miami-Dade. If it's Broward, you put Broward, and so forth. The property tax ID, that is, just imagine that it's like your social security number. Every property has a tax ID number, and which is synonymous with folio number. So both of those if you see folio or tax ID, it's the same thing. That's the number that identifies that particular parcel and that particular property. So you want to make sure that you put that in there. This information can also be pulled from public records. If you go into the county property appraiser's office, you can pull that information from there. Just as you can on line C, the legal description. The legal description is also going to be in public record that you can copy and paste it on there. Your next line is going to be your personal property, which is, unless excluded, all these items that you see on here are going to be included in the sale. Now, it's very important that you look at MLS and see if there's anything that's excluded. I usually take whatever they have included in MLS and I'll copy paste and I'll put it in there to make sure that I have all the items that they included as per MLS, and then I print the MLS sheet to save it as a reference and a record of what was included. So usually agents will put what's included in their dishwasher, refrigerator, stove, oven, microwave, or any other items that are included. They'll usually put it in there. Now, if I'm walking through a house, as I show it, before I prepare the contract, and I see that there's 3 ceiling fans, I note that, and I put the amount of ceiling fans that are there as well, 3 ceiling fans, 4 ceiling fans, or anything else for that matter. And I lay it out, because the contract itself only says ceiling fan or fans. I like to put the amount. If something is excluded, and a lot of times you'll see that they exclude a chandelier that's maybe an heirloom, or any other item that is a personal item to them and they want to exclude it from the sale, usually lighting is big, then you want to go ahead and you want to make sure that you put anything that is excluded on line E. On the next line item, which is purchase price, you're going to put the amount that you're offering on for the property, which is the purchase price. Please use decimals always. I see a lot of agents that don't use decimals, and it's very important that the contract is unambiguous so to avoid any future disputes. So put your currency in there correctly with your decimals. On line 2A, you're going to be putting the initial deposit that's going to be held in the escrow account. All offers must have an escrow deposit. So try to keep your escrow deposit right around 5,000. I know during these times where we're in a seller's market, we have to get a little bit more creative, but try not to put your client out there to where there's a lot of money out there on escrow from the beginning. You'll have another opportunity to put a second escrow uh, later on, and perhaps maybe you can put a little bit more once your client feels comfortable and gets past inspection. You also, on the next line item, where it says check one right here, I always put this one here. So the deposit is to be made within 3 days if left blank. Now remember, by law, you cannot hold that escrow check more than 72 hours unless there's a holiday in between. So if you took the check on Friday, by Monday, it needs to be deposited in the escrow account. Now, in the event that Monday is a holiday, then you're allowed to go to Tuesday, but only in those events where it is a federal holiday. So the escrow agent information on here should be New World Title, the address to New World Title, which is the Miami Lakes office, the phone number and email address. Make sure that you put all that information in there because if you're representing a buyer and the listing agent is receiving this contract, he wants to make sure that he has all the contact information correct so he can reach out to the title agent if he hasn't gotten his escrow letter and request it, and they will need communication anyways with the escrow agent. On line B, there's where you have an opportunity to put an additional deposit. Now, what I usually do with this additional deposit is if my inspection period is 10 days, then I'll leave it blank. And if we're going to put a second deposit, then we'll add the second deposit at the 10 days. But if my inspection period is 15 days, then I'll change that to 15 simply because I want to make sure my client's passed inspection and has agreed to move forward with the purchase before he puts his second deposit. Financing. On this line item C, you can either express financing either in dollar amount, make sure you use decimals again, or percentage amount. If you use either or dollar amount or percentage amount, it's going to calculate the balance to close at the bottom automatically. So, hypothetically speaking, if there's a purchase of $100,000, your initial deposit on line 2A is $5,000. Your second deposit is another $5,000, and your financing is 80%. That means that your funds to close is going to be $10,000 because you have $10,000 down payment total that you have already on the contract that's going to be applied to the purchase. And the loan to value is 80%. That would be $20,000 total for down payment. So the balance to close would come up as $10,000 there. Time of acceptance. And let me just go ahead and lay it out so you guys can see the way it works. So I always put the decimals in. Then you're going to do your deposit amount. Then here you're going to put your New World Title. The address, you'll put the address in depending on the office of New World that you're using, the phone number for that office, and the email for that, which here it would be, you'll be dealing with Vanessa. Additional deposit would be another $5,000. Financing, as we said, would be 80% loan to value. And other, we're not putting anything other, so that would be zero. So the balance to close would be $10,000, just as I explained. All right, so now for number 3, time for acceptance as offer and counteroffers. I use this as a negotiating tool, and I'll give you an example. Right now, there's multiple offers on all properties. So with that said, if you put down here, if you're sending an offer in, and you put down here that it needs to be accepted within, let's say we're putting the offer in today and you want an acceptance by June 24th, 2021, which is tomorrow, that means that if they don't accept the offer by June 24, 2021, your offer is no good. Well, a lot of times there's multiple offers and you may not get a response in 24 hours because they're going to want to review all the offers. So you have to kind of carefully look at the property and see is this is one of the ones that you want to put pressure or not. I just used it yesterday, and I used it yesterday, and I gave 24-hour notice to respond to an offer simply because I was going 30K over asking, and it was cash, and the asking price was 300,000. So on a $300,000 purchase, coming in at 10% above asking price is pretty significant. So, and being that it was cash, I wanted to put a little pressure on the seller's side to let them know that we're walking. After 24 hours, this offer was no good. So that way they couldn't sit there and simmer and use my offer to get other offers to come up or wait for another cash offer that was greater. So you got to be very careful when you use this, okay? So if I know that an agent told me, hey, listen, I've got 10 offers and we're not going to be reviewing offers till Friday, and I'm submitting the offer on Tuesday, and the seller's not going to be reviewing the offers till Friday, why would I put an expiration date on that? So I would leave it blank at that point and hope that we have the best offer. Closing date. On closing date, I usually use the on or before, and then I put the date. Reason being is that if we have an opportunity to close earlier and the seller agrees, everybody wants to get their contract closed because ultimately nobody gets paid until the contract closes. So generally speaking, on a finance deal in this market, you want to come in, you'd like to get in there and get it done within 30 days. But don't be surprised if there's an extension needed because even title is behind. We're so busy. Everything's so busy lately that sometimes things are a little bit delayed. So closing could take anywhere from 30 to 45 days. So you'll have to see where you think you're at with the type of client that you have. Extension of closing number 5. This paragraph is really, really important. And I'm going to tell you why it's very important because a lot of people don't understand what this says. So lenders are required to disclose the closing costs and give full disclosure to the buyer prior 3 days, 72 hours before closing. They need to have an opportunity to review. The buyer needs to have an opportunity to review all the figures, and so they allow 3 days to do that. So anytime the lender discloses, the moment he discloses, you got to wait 72 hours to close. So in this paragraph, what happens is, let's say you have a closing date of June 24th, and today's June 23rd, and your closing is supposed to be tomorrow, but the disclosures didn't go out today. Thereby, you won't be able to close on the 24th legally, so you're going to have to wait the 3 days. So if you're disclosing on the 23rd, you're going to close on the 27th. So you're out of contract because your contract expired on the 24th. Well, this paragraph automatically extends the contract up to 10 days. It can't exceed 10 days, but up to 10 days. So the reason they did that is because if there's any changes made, let's say the disclosure goes out on the 23rd. However, on the 24th, they determined that there was a change that needed to be made on that disclosure, and it changed the figures, and they got to redisclose. Now, instead of closing on the 27th, you got to close on the 28th. So they've already prepared the contract to protect under those circumstances that you're protected for TRID if they do need to extend automatically. Now, you're going to find a lot of attorneys, a lot of selling agents and whatnot that are going to want you to send them an extension. It's fine. You can do an extension. It's pretty redundant because the contract already has a provision that automatically extends it, but it won't hurt you if they require you to do an extension anyways. So if they require you to do an extension on the contract for, let's say, 3 days to cover your closing, just do the extension. It's really not that big of a deal. In the event, now number B, in the event of constituting a force majeure, for those of you that don't understand what force majeure is, basically you can't be forced to close if There's an unavailability of utilities. You don't have hazard insurance, which is going to be required by the lender for you to have the homeowner's insurance. So let's just say there's a storm and a hurricane, which is very possible down here in South Florida during your hurricane season. And there's a hurricane warning issued, and South Florida is in that warning. Immediately when that happens, the insurance companies are going to stop writing, and they're not going to bind anything because there's too big of a risk for them at that point to bind a policy when there's a storm coming in. So they'd rather not be in that situation of have the risk. So they're not going to bind. So you won't be able to close. So let's say the storm passes, or we really don't get hit by the storm, but we've got some outer bands or whatnot. Just the fact that we were under hurricane warning, the lender is more than likely going to require, at least at a minimum, a drive-by by the appraiser of that property. The drive-by is going to be basically to make sure the property, there's no damage that's visible on the exterior of the home, to ensure that they're not binding a property that's already been damaged by a storm. So don't be surprised. That's quite common down here. If your insurance isn't binded, that you'll have to wait, and the seller has to wait. There's nothing they can do. It's the contract is protecting you for that purpose. Occupancy and possession. All right, this one here. If you're representing the seller, it's very important for you to understand that the property does not belong to the buyer technically until the seller receives their funds. So when you see on a listing that possession, it says funding, what that means is that the seller is not going to turn over keys after closing until he's confirmed that he's received his funds. And funds are usually sent by wire nowadays, and it's relatively quick. But there's always those cases where you do a closing at 5 o'clock on a Friday, and the wire goes out, and it isn't posted till Monday, or maybe if the bank posts on Saturday. But worst case scenario, let's say it doesn't post till Monday. So if the seller hasn't received his funds, the house doesn't belong to the buyer yet. So they're going to probably want to hold off and giving keys out until Monday. I would encourage you, if you're representing a seller, never to turn over keys until your client has confirmed that they have received funding. You're probably wondering why they're going to get the funding on Monday. Well, a lot of things can happen from over the weekend. You never know, but it could be a case of where the lender reviews the file and decides that they're going to call the loaner. They're just not going to fund it because they found a discrepancy. Could have been something came back on a 4506 that they were waiting on. Who knows? Anything can happen. So to avoid being caught in a situation where you've turned over keys to a buyer and the seller hasn't received their funds, and the buyer decided on Friday after he closed he's going to start rehabbing the property because he wants an open floor plan, and knocks down 3 interior walls and has exposed plumbing, and now the loan didn't fund, and the seller now has a house that is demolished. So you don't want to ever put yourself in that situation. I always recommend wait till funding is confirmed. On B, if the property is subject to a lease or occupancy after closing, you have to disclose it. And this is quite common, where you'll have someone living in a property, they got a couple months left on their lease, or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever the case may be. The buyer wants the property, he wants to live in it, or he wants it as an investment, but it's subject to a lease. That needs to be checked off, and the buyer has to be provided with a copy of that lease and needs to have time to review it. And obviously, if the buyer's sole discretion, the terms of that lease are not acceptable to the buyer can terminate the contract by delivering written notice of that within 5 days of receipt of that lease. So it does protect your buyer in the sense that if they disclosed that the tenant is paying $2,000 a month and the lease expires in October 31st, and you agreed on that verbally, that's what was disclosed to you, and later on you get a lease agreement that says he's paying $1,500 a month, the lease doesn't expire until January 15th. Your client might not want that property, might not want to get into that investment, or might not want to take it on as an end user because his mortgage might be much more than he's collecting rent, and it just doesn't make sense. So make sure that you check that box off and request a copy of that lease. Now, whenever it's subject to a lease at closing, you're going to have a tenant estoppel letter. And the title company that is preparing the closing docs will be able to provide you with a blank copy of that tenant estoppel letter. The tenant estoppel letter is basically a form that is filled out by both the landlord and the tenant. Both of them sign acknowledging what monies that landlord is holding. Could be advance rent, security deposit, things of that sort. That's done to avoid any dispute as to what the new buyer is going to be receiving at closing, because at closing, that new buyer is going to be getting the rents, the advance rents and security deposit, and even maybe if he closes in the middle of a month and the tenant has already paid, for example, the month of June, and we're closing today, there's still 6 days that need to be prorated off that rent that need to be transferred to the buyer that's buying the property because he's the owner from the 24th forward. So make sure that you request that tenant estoppel letter right at the beginning of the contract. The moment that you request the lease, start getting that tenant estoppels to avoid that there's no discrepancy as well from what the lease says to what the tenant writes on that tenant estoppel letter. Assignability. So the box number 1 here on number 7, assignability, says buyer may assign and thereby be released from any further liability under this contract. In all my years in real estate, have never checked that box off. It really makes no sense to me, because if I'm on the listing side, why would I accept a contract from somebody that can assign it and be released under further liability when I have no control who he assigns it to, who he or she assigns it to, and the person that they're assigning it to may not even have the funds or the credit or the financing to carry out the purchase. And I'm releasing the original buyer from any liability. The second line I've used, and the second box and the third box I've used on many occasions. Now, the second box, this one right here, which may assign but not be released from liability under this contract, is used quite frequently for investors. Investors are usually putting offers on multiple properties. And I mean, in one day, they may send out 3, 4, 5 offers, 6 offers, 10 offers, and they don't know which one's going to get accepted. They're going to go through an inspection period. They don't know if they're going to cancel. So it would make no sense for them to create a corporation and pay the cost of creating a corporation for each individual offer they make when they don't know if their offer is going to be accepted. So what usually happens with investors, that they put an offer through on this right as soon as they get past their inspection period and they know they're committed to the purchase and they've reviewed title, they'll go on Sunbiz and create a corporation, apply for a tax ID, which they can get within 48 hours. You can have all that taken care of, and then assign the contract to the corporation they created. They're still responsible on the personal level, or however they submitted the offer in the beginning, but now that contract will be able to close under a corporation name. Thereby, they do this to protect their assets. They put each property in a separate corporation. Now, on an end user and someone who's going to be an owner occupied, what you should be seeing is may not assign this contract, because a person's not coming in an investor. He's going to keep the property, so you want to check off may not assign instead. Financing. This line, I want you to follow me closely on financing, because financing is going to be one of your exit clauses and contingencies if you need to cancel a contract. But you need to understand it completely to make sure that you stay within that time frame of when you can do so. So if you check off 8A, that means the buyer is going to pay cash for the purchase, and there's no finance contingency at all. So that finance contingency is removed because he's paying cash. Just because you're going in on a cash offer, though, does not mean that you cannot add an appraisal contingency. Now, granted, in this seller's market, people are waiving appraisal contingencies that are going in with cash. So you got to be careful because your offer won't get accepted. But in the event that we switch over into now a buyer's market and you have a client that is putting a cash offer, you can always add an appraisal contingency so your client doesn't pay above appraisal. It's up to you. But just because you're paying cash doesn't mean that you don't have to have an appraisal contingency. You can always add that as an addendum and put a minimum amount that it needs to appraise for, or your buyer can cancel. And in a buyer's market, that would give you a little bit of negotiating power if the appraisal should come in lower than what your contract price is. If you check off 8B, that means that the contract would be subject. This contract is contingent on buyer obtaining approval of a loan, which you'd have to check off whether your buyer is going with a conventional, a VA, or FHA, or VA, or other. Other is usually used when they're using private financing. And then usually they'll check off other and they'll write right on this line, they'll write private lender, private. And that way we know that it's a private lender, okay? Private lender is also going to be able to provide you with a letter saying under what parameters they'll lend the money. Now, this next line is very important because if you leave it blank, that means you have 30 days after the effective date to obtain loan approval, which the loan approval is basically, it's synonymous with what lenders call a commitment letter. What is a commitment letter? A commitment letter is when the lender has reviewed the loan package, has reviewed the documentation, and has issued a loan approval, and usually there's conditions. So I always want to see that when I'm representing a seller. I always request that commitment letter to make sure that I see that the conditions that are on there are actually surmountable conditions, okay? Because there may be insurmountable. A great file is when you just conditions that you need, obviously, marketable title and insurance, hazard insurance binding before closing, and a survey, and the general things that you know that are very simple. But if there's a lot more than that and the file's been taken, you want to make sure that you look at that commitment to make sure that their conditions are not insurmountable. Now, the trick here is that if you do not obtain a commitment, whether it be with conditions or not, within that period that you have, you lose that finance contingency. And remember, this contract, this purchase is contingent on the buyer being able to finance. So if the buyer's loan is denied, the contract can be canceled and the buyer's entitled to receive their escrow funds back. Now, if you don't provide a letter and you let this expire, this basically becomes a cash transaction and your buyer loses the right to cancel for the loan denial. So you want to make sure you're on top of that. And if you're getting close to that commitment period and you're a couple days away and the lender's telling you, hey, I need another week, you better go in and request an extension to the commitment period just to make sure that you're covered and you're covering that contingency and making sure that your client is covered for that, okay? Now, usually we don't see a lot of adjustable mortgages now. We're seeing mostly fixed. So you'd check off the type of mortgage that your client is applying for. Rates have been really low, but this line item has been used because you may have a client that is okay. Let's say he was quoted at 3.125, and the lender told you, hey, listen, even if the rate goes up to 3.5, his ratios are still good and he can qualify. So if that's the case, you'd put the amount of the rate that the maximum that your buyer would be able to qualify for. So if the rates happen to go up, he's got an exit clause on that. Okay. As a listing agent, to be quite frankly, I like seeing this blank and seeing prevailing rate because I know that it's another out for the client, although rates have been pretty steady, and they haven't been bouncing around, and we hope they'll stay steady for a bit. So you'll just have to watch that as the economy takes its turns. So the buyer shall make loan application within 5 days on the next line item 2I, if you leave it blank. That's reasonable for them to make application within the first 5 days. I usually leave it blank. You don't want them going any more than that, because if they take long in applying, it's going to delay everything in the end. So you want to make sure that the buyer's getting their financing in as quickly as possible. So it's the buyer's responsibility, as you can read here on line number 95 here, to use diligent effort to obtain the loan approval during the loan approval process. And diligent effort obviously includes them providing all the documentation that they need to provide for that loan to be approved. So when you're working with a lender, there's going to be a lot of documents that need to be provided: bank statements, tax returns, W-2s. They're going to ask you for everything they need to make sure that they can get the loan processed. Any delays caused by not providing documentation in a timely manner fall back on the buyer. So the buyer has that obligation to get that done. So make sure that if you're representing your buyer, that you're on top of it and the buyer understands that they have a responsibility under this contract and they need to meet that responsibility, because there's consequences, and you'll be able to read there's consequences for breach of contract. And both sides have obligations on this contract, and both sides there can be a penalty on either side for not meeting those obligations. So I'm going to ask that you read this, because basically it's self-explanatory and there's no sense in me reading it for you. You can read it, and it's very easy. The beautiful thing about this FAR bar contract, that it was created by the Florida Bar Association, and what it does is it's a pretty even contract on both sides, but it's laid out pretty simple and layman's term for a person of just a normal person can read it and understand what it means. However, I want to express something to you. You're not an attorney. You're a real estate agent. And even if you are an attorney and you're working as a real estate agent and you've not been retained to give legal advice, there's a fine line there. We're not here to give legal advice. The client has a problem understanding the contract completely. I would suggest that they hire an attorney for the attorney to advise them, okay? You can read the contract to them, but do not give any legal advice in any way, okay? We're going to go to number 9, closing costs, title insurance survey, home warranty, special assessment. This was created to give a general idea of what responsibilities belong to the seller and what responsibilities become to the buyer. That is financial responsibility to be paid at closing. Okay, these are the customary things that are paid for by the seller, and these are the customary things that are buyer. But remember, a contract is an agreement by at least two parties that have come to a meeting of the minds. So whatever you put on whatever the paper holds, that's what the contract is. So if you have a contract whereby you've written on additional terms or agreed on this contract in writing that the buyer is going to pay for any of those costs that are normally attributed to the seller, you can do that. Just like it can be vice versa, where the seller can pay the closing cost or provide a seller contribution to pay for the closing costs of the buyer. So these are customary, but all this can be altered, and you can change the contract to include that the buyer will take on responsibility of the seller, or the seller would take responsibilities of the buyer. Title evidence and insurance. I see this one here. I'm going to explain to you that I see a lot of agents that are representing a buyer and don't take the time to review the title policy. So what happens is that the title agent that's preparing the documents for closing is going to get a title insurance commitment. That title insurance commitment is going to lay out what exactly is being insured in that title. If there's any exceptions, they're going to have to know what the exception is. That's very important for the buyer to know. If there's an exception on the title, the exception could be that there's an open permit, an expired permit, or something of that matter, where they're going to have to sign a hold harmless at closing. So I'm going to encourage you to always request a copy of that immediately, and tell the title agent when you go under contract, send an email and say, look, as soon as you have evidence of title and the title commitment, please send us a copy so that my client has an opportunity to review it. Okay, so that's very, very important. You want to know, make sure that you know what you're getting into. I personally, if there's an open permit, unless my client says, hey, listen, I'll accept it and I'll sign the hold harmless, I always push for everything to be resolved before closing, because I don't want my client to take on any matters that have been a problem that carrying over. I want the seller involved in helping resolve everything. All right, so and the next line item is going to be basically who designates the title agent. I want you to understand, just because if you're representing the seller, just because the buyer designates the title agent, that doesn't mean that your seller cannot use his own attorney to prepare seller docs. They retain the right to use their own attorney to prepare seller docs, but the funding agent is going to be the buyer's agent if you choose two or if you choose three. Okay, for the most part, in Dade County, a lot of the agents are using Miami-Dade County provision. The difference between 2 and 3 is that in 3, the seller is committing to paying for an abstract continuation of the title, and if you leave it blank, he won't pay more than $200. And in line item number 2 here, he's not committing to that. Okay, so it would be an expense covered by the buyer. Now, if you choose the first line item, that the seller shall designate the title agent, that you're going to have to choose that if you're closing in West Palm Beach, because in Palm Beach County, the seller has the right to choose a title agent, but they also have to pay for the buyer's lender policy, and that's a savings for your buyer. Now, don't confuse the buyer's lender policy, okay, with the actual the lender policy is to protect the lender. Okay, that's what it's basically what it's for. So, but it's still a savings for your client if that's the case. Okay. Next is the survey. Always remember that if it's a cash purchase, they're not required to order a survey. So if you're representing a buyer and your buyer is a cash buyer, always ask your buyer, hey, listen, do you want a survey? I do recommend a survey just in case you want to put a fence up, or you want to know the existing fence that's there, who it belongs to, whether it's on your property or the neighbor's property, or if there's any encroachment on the property that you may not know about. So you always give your client the option of requesting. If it's a financed transaction, it's automatic. The lender is not going to close without having a survey. The lender's going to want to make sure that there's no encroachments on the property, and he needs that documented. Home warranty plans. If it's a used home, you're obviously not going to have a warranty. But sometimes sellers have a warranty plan that they pay for themselves, and it's transferable. And if they disclose that on MLS, then obviously you can add it on there, and if it's and you can determine whether it's going to be paid by the buyer or the seller. Sometimes the seller will pay for the home, or it's paid already and it's just going to transfer over, and they get to keep it till it expires. All right, special assessments. All right, special assessments are more prevalent in condominium associations. The reason is that because condominium, basically, it's shared space. Most homeowner associations are usually lot and blocks, and but there are those that aren't. So there could be the case where there could be an assessment passed in a homeowner association as well, although it's not as prevalent. But I've seen them for road repairs and whatnot on interior roads that belong to the community. So basically, if there's an assessment on the property that was passed, and you check off that the line A, seller shall pay installments prior to closing, and buyer shall pay installments due after closing, that means that if there was a $20,000 assessment and they've paid $10,000 of it off already, and your buyer closes, your buyer is going to be responsible for that assessment moving forward. Now, if you check off B, which was what I would recommend, is that the seller is going to pay that assessment in full at the time of closing. Whenever I submit an offer and there's an association, I always check off B going in, just in case they haven't disclosed that there is an assessment. Then I want to make sure that I know. For the most part, if an agent is savvy, he's going to ask that question, and he's going to put on MLS if there's an assessment, and he's probably going to disclose, he or she, I'm sorry, going to disclose that whether it's going to be paid at closing by the seller or whether they're going to require the buyer to assume that assessment. Now, don't get confused with what a community development district is. Basically, it's an assessment, but that runs when your taxes. What is a community development district? Community development district is any new construction. Well, let me give you a little bit of more detail. So a developer goes in and finds a raw piece of land. And when he finds that raw piece of land, he obviously, in order to develop it, he's got to create roads, he's got to create drainage, and he's got to build the infrastructure to support the community. So once he builds that infrastructure, there's a cost to him. Back in the day, they used to pass on that cost as an impact fee at closing. Nowadays, the way they created a community development district, and that amount they used to charge you as an impact fee at closing now is financed over your taxes on the non-ad valorem section. Basically, it's financed over 30 years. So if you buy in a new community and the community has a CDD, there's going to be a payment that you're making on your taxes for the next 30 years to cover that impact fee for all the roads and everything else that were put in the community. Okay, so if you sell the property, the CDD runs with that property. So that is, it doesn't, this assessment doesn't apply to that. The buyer is assuming the CDD. So for example, you're selling a property that 10 years ago was purchased with a CDD of 30 years. They've already paid 10 years. Your buyer is going to have 20 years left of that CDD. Okay. And if you look up the tax bill, you'll be able to see the amount on there on the non-ad valorem section. Number 10, disclosures. Radon gas is naturally occurring, but it's underground. So here in South Florida, we don't have basements. There's only one neighborhood that I know of in all of South Florida, which is off of Ives Dairy Road and Ives Estates, that has a partial basement. And in that case, you could get a radon test, but I've never had an inspector upsell for radon in South Florida because we have no basements. So you shouldn't be encountering anything with radon gas down here in South Florida. B, permit disclosures. The seller is responsible in helping you resolve and closing out any open permits or improvements or disclosing that. So please read that permit disclosure paragraph and make sure that you understand it. Now, C is very particular to me. I believe I'm probably the authority on mold because I have a very allergic daughter, and I've had to learn a lot about mold. This is a huge upsell in inspections, one that you should be very well versed on because mold is naturally occurring. It's literally everywhere. You'll find that people that have mild allergies during the mold season, during the pollen season, have sniffles and whatnot. So mold can get in your house just by opening the door. It's in the air. It's everywhere. The difference between the bad mold and the good mold is that the bad mold can actually make you sick. And those are called myotoxins. Okay, remember that word, myotoxins. Write it down and keep it with you. The problem with these inspectors out here is that they provide you a report and they list a sleuth of molds that they found in the house that they're inspecting, and none of them are myotoxins. So these are molds that you'd find in every house. For example, I can go swab any air conditioner down here in South Florida, and I'm going to find a specific type of mold in that because there's moisture. So I'm going to find a mold. However, they don't cause any respiratory issues. And a lot of people will take and put an ultraviolet light if they're really allergic to make sure that the ultraviolet light filters the air through and kills anything that's going through the AC, but it's naturally occurring. But when they send your buyer the report, the buyer is going to see, oh, the property has mold. So make sure that you're well versed to explain to that buyer that these are naturally occurring molds that are everywhere, and the ones that they should be concerned about are myotoxins. I wish inspectors would list which are the myotoxins, but you can Google the molds that they list on there and find that they're not myotoxins, so your client would be at ease, okay? The only way literally to have no mold whatsoever would be to have a hyperbaric chamber, make sure that the air that's pumped in is filtered, and that you never open it. And you're not going to find a house like that. So you're always going to find some mold in a house. Flood and elevation certificate. Again, if you're buying with financing, you won't be required to have a flood or zone or elevation certificate prepared. So always ask your client if he wants an elevation certificate. And if he does want an elevation certificate and he's buying cash, you need to tell the title agent to please order that elevation certificate, or you won't have one when you go to closing. Now, if it's a finance property, you can rest assured that they're going to order an elevation certificate, and the lender is going to want to know whether it's in a flood zone because he's going to require that the borrower have flood insurance. Lead-based paint disclosure. This is an addendum that is available if the house was built prior to 1978. Then you're required to disclose that that there may be lead-based paint. Lead-based paint was taken off the market. They determined that it was dangerous to your health. However, most of the houses out here that were built prior to 78 that may have lead-based paint have been painted over quite a few times. And quite frankly, the lead-based paint is it's not dangerous to you unless you're out there sanding it and remodeling and disturbing it. So if you're going to do if your buyer's buying an older home and they're going to do some remodeling, they're going to want to know that they want to wear a respirator if they're going to be knocking down walls or disturbing the lead-based paint, and you want to make sure you disclose to them that they understand that. Homeowner, next is G, homeowner association community disclosure. This is very important that if you're representing a buyer, that you have an association disclosure. That form, the association disclosure, is going to lay out what the fees are for the association, and so you have full disclosure going in on what to expect and what the client is going to be paying for the association. I is foreign investment in real estate tax. So foreign people, someone who's a foreigner, they may not have a tax ID. They may just have a TIN number or whatnot. So what happens is if they're a foreigner and they sell a property, there's a withholding that is held to make sure that that seller doesn't owe any money in taxes. So if you're saying for a foreign investor, just make sure they understand that there's going to be some money held back and that you point out this paragraph to them. Seller disclosure. So on J, in Florida, sellers need to disclose any material facts affecting the value of the property which are not readily observable by the buyer. Okay, so if a seller knows that the foundation is cracked, or the seller knows that the roof is leaking and he put a claim on that roof, he has to disclose it. So always make sure that you request a seller property disclosure when representing a buyer. And then if you're representing the seller, make sure that you provide one and you ask your seller to provide one. Okay, our next line item is going to be number 11, which is property maintenance. This is very important as well because you need to advise your seller that just because you got under contract doesn't mean you fire the pool guy, doesn't mean you stop cutting the grass, doesn't mean you stop maintaining the property. The property needs to be maintained in the same condition that it was when that buyer saw that property and got the inspection done. So the pool needs to be turned over clean, shrubbery needs to be in order, lawn needs to be cut, and if anything breaks, for example, a refrigerator, and let's say the refrigerator compressor goes out, he needs to replace it with something similar to that one. He can't go buy, if he had a $5,000 or a $10,000 Sub-Zero, throw in a $1,500 refrigerator. He has to buy something of the same value. Okay, so they still have to, they have that as is maintenance requirement there. Number 12 is property inspections and right to cancel. This is your first out on the contract. Whatever amount of time you specify there, whether it be 1 day to 15 days or 30 days, whatever you put there that the buyer is going to have as an inspection period, is the amount of time that he has to cancel. And he has the right to cancel, or she, I'm sorry, they have the right to cancel under their sole discretion. You can see where it says in buyer's sole discretion. What does that mean? That means that he doesn't have to rely on anyone else, not on inspection, not on anything, just on the fact that they no longer want to buy the property. It could be because they woke up in the morning and just decided that's not the house for me. You don't have to have any particular excuse, sole discretion. So this is very important because during that period, your client can secure getting their escrow deposit back without any issue. If once you get past this inspection period, then you enter into the finance period. And if you're in a cash transaction, you don't have any other contingency. You got to move forward to closing. Walkthrough, inspection, and reinspection. Okay. This walkthrough inspection is very important, and please don't ever forego it, because there has been cases where a walkthrough hasn't been done, and then they go after closing to the property, the appliances aren't there, something's broken, fans are missing. So I always do that walkthrough. I like doing the walkthrough the day of closing. I don't even like doing it the day before closing, because if I go the day before closing and overnight someone goes in there, removes the appliances, stakes the ceiling fans, destroys the property, vandalizes it at night, my client's going to go close and walk into that house the next day, and everything is damaged or something's missing. So there are going to be those occasions where you have a buyer and says, hey, listen, I can't do the walkthrough in the morning. I can do it tonight because you're closing at 12 and he's got to work in the morning. So what I do is I say, that's fine. We'll go do the walkthrough the evening before. And then in the morning, before closing, I go alone and I do a video of the house and do the walkthrough again, so that I'm time stamping it, that in the morning before closing, everything was as it should be. Okay. That's an extra protection that's going to set you apart from the rest, and it's going to save you a headache that could come about. Okay. Now, always note that when you do your walkthrough, let's say you had 3 ceiling fans, and I'm going to give you an example. I recently, not recently, but a little over a year ago, was involved in a transaction to where there was some really nice fans in the patio, and that were made by a company that's called the Big Ass Fan Company, and they're pretty pricey fans. And so when we did the walkthrough, I noticed that they had changed those fans. There was 2 of them in the patio in the back, and they were pretty large fans, and they put just regular 52-inch fans. And I had taken pictures of those fans during our initial inspection, and there was pictures of them from the inspection as well. So immediately, from the house, I called the seller's agent, and advised them that, hey, listen, we have an issue here. The fans that were here during the inspection and the time that the buyer saw the property have been changed out, and they changed them for something inferior, and my client would like the original fans. Well, they couldn't put the fans back, so we went online. We found out what the cost of those fans were. We prepared an addendum, and at closing, the seller had to give an additional credit for the cost of those fans, brand new. Okay, so make sure that you keep an eye on that. It does happen. It's South Florida. It's unfortunate, but we see that sometimes. Sometimes it's not done with malice. The seller failed to tell the buyer, hey, listen, you can't take any of this stuff. This all belongs with the house now. So just Make sure that if you're on the selling side, you express to your client what he can take and what he cannot take, what's included in the sale and what is not, and vice versa. All right, so seller assistance and cooperation in closing out permits, building permits. This paragraph protects your buyer in where the seller is committed to assisting in anything that needs to be done to make sure that the properties, that the any permits that are open or expired are corrected prior to closing. Okay. D is assignment of repair of treatment contracts and warranties. The most prevalent assignment of contract that you're going to see, treatment contract, is going to be for termites. In South Florida, termites are naturally occurring. They fly, they get into a property. A lot of people that have tented will opt to pay the warranty after tenting to make sure they're covered for at least 5 years. And a lot of times those warranties are transferable. So it's important that you ask the seller if he has a termite treatment contract and whether it's transferable or not. Escrow agent, I'm going to ask you to read number 13. It's pretty self-explanatory. They do a very good job at explaining what it is, but your escrow agent is going to be the person holding the deposit and receiving the funds from the buyer to hold that will be applied later to the closing. I know I touched on number 14 earlier about professional advice and broker liability. I'm going to ask you to read this full paragraph again and remind you that you're not an attorney, okay? We do have, all of us do have the ability to call the legal hotline if you're paying your board fees. There's a legal hotline that you can call if you have any legal questions that you need to ask for yourself to understand. You can certainly reach out, and it's free to you because you're paying for it through your board fees. Default and dispute resolution. I know earlier I told you that everybody has, both buyer and seller have obligations. This lays out what the buyer's obligations under the contract, what would constitute a default. And just so you all understand, if either side defaults, obviously the other side can bring suit. And the courts have in the past awarded attorney's fees to the prevailing party. So if your buyer defaults and the seller needs to sue the buyer and the seller prevails in court, more than likely it's going to be responsible not only for the default, but also for attorney's fees and vice versa. Dispute resolution. Usually, if there's a dispute, let's say the contract, something happens, there's a default, buyer couldn't close, and you have the seller going after the buyer's deposit. The seller doesn't automatically get the deposit. He needs to go through, if there's a controversy of such, there's going to have to be, if there's going to be conflicting demand, you're going to have 10 days to see if there's an attempt to dispute this. So you're not going to be able to just go to court right away. And they're probably going to add mediation rules regardless, because the courts in South Florida require mediation before you even get to a judge. So if there's a $5,000 escrow deposit and your buyer defaulted and the seller's going after it, realistically, if he hires an attorney, the attorney's going to cost him up front probably that amount or close to it. So usually what happens is that there's a negotiation done, and a lot of times they'll split the deposit and they'll work something out within those 10 days so everybody walks away and licks their wounds. If there's a huge deposit, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, you can bet it probably end up with attorneys. And then at that point, then they'll have to wait the 10 days regardless. But at that point, it'll get to the court or mediation at some point. All right, so if they do have to go to mediation, obviously it's a cost incurred by both parties. They got to split that fee equally, and then it goes, if there's an impasse on mediation, then it'll get to the court, and then the judge will decide, and then at that time, reasonable attorney's fees will be awarded to the prevailing party. Title evidence, restriction, easements, and limitations. I touched on that earlier. Remember, I told you how important it is to get a copy of the title evidence, restrictions, or anything that's excluded. This paragraph covers that. I'll ask you to read that. The paragraph A1 and 2 will cover both of those, and it's pretty self-explanatory. You need to read it, and it explains it completely in layman's term. Survey, I discussed to you about the survey that discloses encroachments as well. Remember that it's very important for you to request it if you're buying cash. Ingress and egress. Every property has to have ingress and egress to get into and out of the property. What is ingress? A way in. What is egress? A way out. Sometimes in the farm homes that are, for example, I'm going to use, let's just use Davie, for example. They'll have a 5-acre parcel. There'll be a house in the front and a house all the way in the back with a little side road at the edge of the property. That ingress and egress should be disclosed on the survey so that you see it. And by law, they can't block ingress and egress once it's established for that particular property. Lease information, we touched also in the beginning of it. This lays out a little bit of information that the seller shall at least 10 days prior to closing furnish estoppel letters, and we talked about the estoppel letters. This should be done at least 10 days prior to closing. I usually like doing it right at the beginning and getting it out of the way. So if there's any discrepancy between the lease agreement and the information provided on the estoppel letter for the tenant, that we can iron them out and figure out where the problem is before we get closer to closing. Okay. Liens, the title agent preparing the closing docs will be requesting a lien search on the property, and obviously you'll have the ability to review that lien search and make sure that it's everything is in order before you close. Now on these contracts, remember, it's automatically calendar days. Okay, so if you get a contract that says that you receive a contract representing a seller, and it says that all time frames will be calculated on business days, then that would mean that Saturday and Sunday are excluded. So that can extend your contract quite a bit. By default, they are all calculated on calendar days, with the exclusion of the legal holidays. So in the event that their property is, you're supposed to close on, and it lands on a legal holiday, this contract extends automatically to 5 p.m. the following business day. Force majeure, we discussed that earlier with regards to the closing date. This lays out a little bit more time, a little bit more information on it. If there's a storm, an earthquake, a natural disaster, the contract can be extended basically up to 30 days to give time for the repairs to be done and whatnot. And if it's not done within 30 days, then you can release your client from the contract. Conveyance, seller shall convey marketable title. So the contract lays out that the seller has to convey marketable title. What is marketable title? Marketable title is basically it's free of liens and encumbrances. Closing, location, documents, and procedure. All right, so you may get an offer in Dade County, and in that offer, the title agent that the buyer chose is located in Palm Beach County or Broward County. Always understand that your buyer has the right to close in the county that the property is located, where the real property is located, and there should be no cost for you if they're out of the county. They should be able to send a mobile closer or notary over to close you in the county that you're in. Closing documents, seller shall, at the prior to closing, execute and deliver as applicable a deed. So this lays out what are the closing documents that need to be signed at that point, and I'd ask you to read it and read also the FinCEN GTO notice. Okay, basically, just so you understand, the closing agents are required to disclose to the U.S. Treasury and Financial Crimes Enforcement anything that they see that may be out of order. And the closing information that's it can be reviewed by the IRS and everyone else, and they feel there's any money laundering in, they can step out and validate the contract. Automatically, when you have a closing, the deed is going to be recorded. Deeds are recorded electronically now, so the title agent takes care of all that recording, and the escrow. This lays out the escrow closing procedure on J. I'm going to ask that you read it. Prorations and credits. Also lays out what are prorations, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what a proration is. One of them would be for property taxes. Property taxes are paid in arrears, which means that, for example, for 2021, the new tax bill will not be available till November 1st. So if you're closing on the property today, you don't have a tax bill for 2021 yet. So the title agent is going to take the tax bill for 2020. They're going to take that tax bill, they're going to divide it by 365 to get a per diem. That per diem cost will be multiplied by the amount of days that the seller has owned the property. So if the seller owned the property for 180 days, that per diem will be multiplied by 180 days, and that amount will be credited to the buyer at closing because the buyer is going to have to pay the taxes in November. So they'll receive a credit on the closing statement for that amount. Okay. Access to the property to conduct appraisals, inspections, and walkthrough. This one is very important in the sense that if you've got a 10-day inspection period, okay, and you call the listing agent and say, hey, listen, we went under contract yesterday. I'd like to get the inspection done today. And they tell you, hey, listen, I can't get you in the property till next week. You got a 10-day inspection period and they've eaten 7 days out of your inspection period. You want that time back because you want your client to have enough time to review that inspection report. They agreed to a 10-day. So I immediately request an extension to the inspection period to make sure that the days that they took from us, they give back to us. Okay? So make sure that that you cover yourself on that so you're not in a situation where you give up your inspection period by them not being available to give you access to the property. Risk of loss is self-explanatory. I'll ask you to read that. 1031 exchanges, those are investors who are usually selling a property and going to be reinvesting that money into another property. They have a set period of time in which they need to identify and reinvest the money, and there's parameters to where they cannot take the money at closing. They need to be deposited with an attorney that does 1031 exchanges. And I suggest that if you're going to be handling a 1031 exchange contract, that you have an attorney on your side for your buyer representing to make sure that it is carried out correctly. So just so you know, none of these contracts that we put together as agents are recorded anywhere in public records. The only thing that's recorded in public records is going to be obviously any deed, a mortgage, and usually an association approval letter that is required. So that's recorded usually with the mortgage. That's done by the title agent at closing. Integration and modification is self-explanatory. You can read, and so is waiver. From here on out, they're all pretty much explanatory and easy to understand. I want to scroll down to the addendas. It's important that you understand that there's all these additional terms. Addendas are available for you in form simplicity, that I would familiarize myself with these addendums to make sure that you understand which one is needed for the particular transaction that you're in. On additional terms, you can always add anything else that the buyer and seller agreed upon, whether it be that the seller is going to contribute $3,000 towards the buyer's closing costs and prepaids, or whether it be that the buyer is going to pay above appraised value by $5,000, pay up to $5,000 above appraised value, but no more than purchase price. All this can be added on here and if it's agreed upon as additional terms. What I will tell you is that whenever you write anything into this contract that you're writing yourself, please read it over 3 or 4 times, have someone else read it for you, and make sure that it is completely unambiguous. Why do you want to make sure it's unambiguous? Because if it's ambiguous and could mean several things, then it could be invalidated the whole term and go to court and it be invalidated because the courts have deemed that anything you put on here has to be unambiguous. It has to. You have to be able to read it and immediately understand. There could be no question as what you're trying to convey. Okay, so keep it simple. And if you don't know exactly how to write it, call one of the mentors or call one of the leaders, and they'll help you put it together. Um, on the last, on line 601, you're going to have 601 to 604. You're going to have signatures of buyers and sellers. And then as you scroll down, you're going to have cooperating sales associate, which would be the buyer's agent, and cooperating broker, which would be the brokerage. And in this case, it would be Lifestyle International Realty. Now, I always put Lifestyle International Realty here, obviously. National Realty here. And then I put the commission amount as well on here, right on the end. So I'll put commission 3%. So that way, as the contract goes to the title agent, he already knows that you're getting paid 3% commission. Now, I also print the MLS sheet for that very reason. I print the MLS sheet the day I show the property. The reason I print the MLS sheet the day I show the property is because when I go to submit this offer, if I showed it and it said that it was 3%, and the next day they lowered the commission on that to 2%, guess what? I have the date that I showed the property, and I have the MLS listing. They owe me the 3% because that was advertised on MLS at the time that I did the showing. So always protect yourself just in case commission is changed. Listing sales associate would be the listing agent, and their listing broker, which would go on that line. This contract needs to be initialed by both buyers and sellers on this bottom part, on all the pages, apart from signatures. That pretty much concludes the whole contract. I hope that I've been able to answer a lot of your questions. Again, you guys have all the leaders' phone numbers, so if you run into any issues or any additional questions, please feel free to contact us. Good luck. I hope you sell 100 million this year. Bye-bye.